Salam and love to all of you. Welcome to the first episode of Musawah's Lighthouse series, a way for us to navigate together towards the light of knowledge. First, let me welcome my co-host Hamiza Azmi, who's the Senior Program Officer for Knowledge Mobilization at Musawah. She's also a feminist writer. Welcome, Miza.
Thank you. So happy to be co-hosting with you, Dr. Amira. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Amira Abu Talib is a visiting scholar at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And she also works very closely at Musawah. She's basically a close friend of ours in various capacities and projects. Over to you, Amira.
Thank you. This series, as I mentioned, is brought to you by Musawah, who most of you know is a global movement working towards gender justice in the Muslim family. In this very first episode, Miza and myself will be talking with Dr. Sofia Rehman about her enlightening new book, Gendering the Hadith Tradition, Recentring the Authority of Aisha, Mother of the Believers. Welcome, Sofia and Miza, and all of you lovely audience here with us. Before we start, Misa will kindly share some housekeeping guidelines to ensure that we have a smooth experience for everyone. Please go ahead, Misa.
So this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube as well, and the recording will be available on Musawah YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Please do be respectful because we do want this to be a constructive as well as a positive space for everyone. As the conversations go on, we'll also be sharing with you resources in the chat, and we'd love to hold even more Lighthouse episodes in the future, so do provide us with your feedback when you get the Google link form.
Thank you, Misa. Okay, Sophia, I really enjoyed reading your book. Not only did it shed light, a new light on Aisha radiallahu anha in a manner that really I've never known before, even though I've studied her, it also speaks to the hadith tradition in general. And I love how you made an effort to contextualize the hadith as a genre for the readers, which makes it a very reader-friendly book. I really appreciated that because oftentimes academic books don't fall within that category. So before we even start, can you tell the audience a little bit about what this book is about, how the idea behind it developed, and maybe a little bit about how you chose to structure the book?
Well, thank you for that, Amira, and thank you to everybody for being here, and you, of course, as well, Miza, both of you for hosting this conversation. And thank you for that great first question. It's so thoughtful, and I'm so glad, Amira, that you found the book illuminating and accessible, because it was actually really important to me that whilst my research, obviously, you know, it has to meet academic standards and it has to meet the criteria for good scholarship, it was always really important to me as well that the broader Muslim community would find it accessible. They were always in my mind. I would say even before I embarked on the research, really, I wanted to ensure that the language was as accessible as is possible without compromising the scholarship. So I'm really pleased to hear that. And that was born out of my own lived experience because there were so many questions that I'd had about Islam that I just wasn't getting satisfactory answers for, no matter who I spoke to, no matter where I was studying, no matter which religious sort of community I found myself in. I just wasn't getting the answers that I wanted. And when I finally did get the answers or started to get answers, it wasn't actually until I went back to university myself, started a master's and then a PhD, and I got access to all this great academic work, and some of which was actually written before I was even born, or some of it written when I was, you know, an infant myself. And I thought, well, why has it taken not only decades to find this work, but then the need for me to access this, you know, very privileged institution that few people will get access to, and then even fewer will get access to this work too. And then if they get access to this work, does the language itself become a barrier to them being able to really understand it? So it's really important to me that actually I managed to do all of these things, be scholarly, be robust in my work, in my research, but at the same time, not make it so out of reach that the very community that I want to have benefit from it
Alienated, yes.
is alienated, exactly. So my book, Gendering the Hadith Tradition, Recentring Aisha, Mother of the Believers, is at its heart an attempt to bring Aisha back into the center of our understanding of Hadith and the Islamic legal tradition in a way that doesn't only highlight her contribution to the Islamic intellectual heritage, but that also gives a potential methodology to continue to apply. And that also opens up ways and possibilities of what it means to be a Muslim woman in the 21st century. So the book was, of course, the outcome of my PhD research. It's a translation and it's a partial translation and a critical study of a 14th century text by Imam al-Zarkashi. It is called Al-Ijaba lima istadraktahu Aisha al-Sahaba, which documents over 200 instances where Aisha corrected or contested statements attributed to the Prophet ﷺ by other companions. And invariably, they're all male companions. There's one outlier, but we can maybe discuss that later. So the idea for the book really developed out of my master's dissertation, which only looked at one chapter in Al-Ijaba. And of course, that just created an itch to go through the whole book because there was just still so much to explore and expand on in conversation with this book, which interestingly was almost lost to us. So the original manuscript, despite it, having been penned by this prolific and respected scholar in his time, and despite this book having actually been dedicated to the Qadi al-Qudat of his time, sort of like the chief judge of his era, the manuscript actually wasn't preserved, and it was only accidentally sort of perchanced upon, first by Said al-Afghani in 1939 in Damascus, and then later on by a Turkish scholar, M.B. Arul, in the late 90s in Istanbul. So, just finding the manuscript, just working on it in itself was just such an exciting thing to do. So the work really was inspired by what I believe likely inspired Imam al-Zarkashi in the first place, and what probably was the cause of so much excitement for Said al-Afghani and Arul when each of them found their respective manuscripts, which is essentially just a deep recognition of how thoroughly Aisha has been hidden in plain sight. So what I mean by that is that if I said to you, Aisha is a marginalized, obscure figure in Islam, I think most people would find that really difficult to accept. They'd be like, well, what do you mean? Walk into any room full of Muslim women and girls, and you have at least 15 who are called Aisha. It's so, she's so prominent in our, sort of consciousness as Muslims. She's present there, but I say that she's hidden in plain sight because she's there, but she's so one-dimensional in character. She's sort of projected as this appendage, as the wife of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. She's devoted and devout, but she's not much of a personality that's independent of him. So, while she was, she was one of the most prolific narrators of hadith, and she was this towering intellectual figure, her critiques, especially of male companions, were often sidelined, or they were lost in the shuffle as the hadith were being canonized. So what I illustrate in the book is that this marginalizing wasn't necessarily some sort of nefarious plan that was hatched against Aisha, but it was a mix of sort of socio-political developments, such as the ways in which the legal schools of thought were developed, intra-religious debates, and sort of debates and debacles, really, that meant overly sensitive and even sort of exaggerated claims about certain companions emerged. And of course, there was some marginalizing from cultural, contextual, and political pressures that were on the religious tradition, which meant that Aisha's positions were overlooked for positions that were more expedient or aligned with, these pressures. So what made Al-Ijaba so compelling as an object of study too is that it just gave so much data. There's over 200 statements of Aisha's. Sometimes I get the question, well, why don't you look at Fatima? Why didn't you look at Zainab? Why didn't you look at, Khadija? Well, we just don't have as much data on them. She outlives the Prophet ﷺ by, another 20 odd years. She is born before the advent of Islam, so she really sees Islam from its beginning through to its, continuation beyond the Prophet ﷺ's own life. So we just have so much rich data from her in this one particular book, especially, which really allowed me to be able to see a pattern emerge in how she engaged with the prophetic tradition critically and methodologically. She wasn't simply preserving the hadith, she was scrutinizing them as well. She was questioning their matan, the content, what was being said, and she was holding to account the transmitters of those statements, sort of setting a precedent for scrutinizing the chain of transmission, the isnad, which of course is, a methodological move that we see happening and developing later on with hadith scholars. But which she sort of indicates a beginning of this process very early on in her own approach to the hadith. So just to quickly talk a bit about the structure of the book, then I designed the book to be interdisciplinary and accessible. I begin with an introduction to Aisha, sort of through three key moments in her life. And these three key moments are selected because they give us a sense of who she was as an individual, which is really important then to developing an understanding of her responses, right? And so just quickly, the three instances are her age at marriage, the slander that happens at the time of, the Prophet ﷺ's life, and then the Battle of the Camel, which happens after the Prophet's passing. And all of these have implications beyond just telling us who she was as an individual. It's the way in which these three particular, instances in her life have been treated that also give us pause to think about actually how is our religious elite, if you like, already informally engaging with the hadith canon in very elastic ways. And it also allows us to think about constructions of Muslim female piety, because obviously how Aisha is constructed as a Muslim woman sets limits and boundaries for who we can be as Muslim women. And what's interesting about these three instances is actually quite often she presents as the opposite of what we're told is a good Muslim woman, like i.e. the quiet, the demure, the sort of the one that goes along, that doesn't ask too many questions. I mean, she's the absolute opposite of all of these things. And then I look at the development of the hadith canon. I looked at the established methodologies of accepting and rejecting hadith and how these can be expanded using Aisha's examples in ways that can, benefit the Muslim community today. I look at a partial translation of Zarkashi's work itself. But beyond just simply translating, I'm providing critical analysis to highlight what Aisha's interventions mean for hadith studies, for Islamic jurisprudence. Because the aim wasn't just to, translate, but it really was to bring out, to extract the methodology that's implicit in her correctives, how she evaluated the hadith, which in turn allowed me to think about what the implications this could have for other corollary branches of Islamic knowledge. I'm thinking about the fiqh, I'm thinking about tafsir, I'm thinking about lots of different branches of knowledge as well beyond hadith that could be impacted. Obviously, I don't go into those in as much depth, but I open up the question within the book. And then finally, I look at one outlier in Al-Ijaba, which is Aisha's response to Fatima bint Qais. So I said that there was one outlier and this was it. And it's significant because it's the only time that Aisha is responding to a woman. But also that in her corrective, she doesn't actually deny Fatima's position, but she explains why it was an exceptional case. And then, I use that then to draw out what I call Aisha's ethic of care when approaching the religious tradition and its praxis. So ultimately, this book is about more than just, revisiting the past. It's about expanding the horizon of possibility for Muslim women and for Muslim men, and for the continued development of the Islamic tradition itself. Because, Aisha, she wasn't on the margins. She was at the heart of Islamic tradition, and really it's time for us to place her back there.
Yes, Sophia, your answer kind of triggered a billion more questions. And I know that this 1 hour that we have is never going to suffice to answer all our questions, let alone all the audience's questions. So we're going to try to, the audience's appetite with some further exploration of the book. But I already, ask people to forgive us. It's not going to cover everything. One thing that you mentioned is how people already know Aisha. Like one of the most referenced or canonized, as they say, sources are biographical dictionaries, and particularly Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, which is like the go-to reference for the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the Tabi'i Tabi'een. Well, I've done a lot of work on that. And when I read about Aisha, I learned about her as being the Prophet's favorite wife, about being extremely pious. But I've also learned about a woman who is very secluded, who doesn't leave her house, who encourages the other wives to remain secluded.
Mm.
That image does not corroborate at all with the findings in your book. So, if I may ask you, can you tell us like the salient findings? And I've also noticed that when I was reading it, there was so much that, about Aisha herself that's new, that allows us to understand women and role model, Muslim women differently, which empowers women on the one hand, but also, as you've alluded to, like the idea of hadith, how do we approach hadith as a genre, which is a very important genre of the Islamic intellectual tradition that's often debated. So if you can briefly maybe talk a little bit about like the most salient findings that you have before we turn it over to Misa to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amira. And I agree. We're going to have so many questions come up, and I guess the only thing I can do is say go and buy the book because it will probably answer a lot of the questions. Um, so I think perhaps, like, if we're talking about some of the most salient findings, then I think the first is that there is this reconceptualizing of Aisha herself. As you said, and I do talk about this in the book as well, that Aisha becomes sort of a signifier, and it becomes almost less about who she historically and factually actually was, because I think if we're going to be honest as scholars, it's difficult to know that with absolute certainty. So what essentially I'm trying to find is, well, what can we find out about her, and what can we take from that allows Muslim women and men, but I'm focused primarily on Muslim women because, Aisha and other Muslim women are used as, standards by which other Muslim women should behave. And how many Muslim women feel excluded from the idea of the ideal Muslim woman that they've been taught about, because they actually don't fit those, tight measures of what makes a good, ideal Muslim woman. And what we find in Aisha is that actually she broadens that, she widens it. So yeah, she was an incredibly sharp and intelligent woman, and she is often referred to as the first scholar of Islam. Uh, and her authority in both, religious knowledge and community affairs was widely recognized, and her words continue to resonate powerfully. Um, and you mentioned about the seclusion aspect of being a Muslim woman. She wasn't just a figure behind the scenes. We know that she was politically active, perhaps not so overtly during the first caliphate of her father and then the second caliphate of Umar radiallahu anhu, but we know that she was, and as the wives in general of the Prophet ﷺ, they were sometimes referred to for help and for guidance. But her political presence, it really comes to the forefront during the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan. He was accused of nepotism, and what's fascinating is that Aisha's home and the home of Salama as well, actually, essentially becomes, a space where concerned voices gathered, what we might now think of, as a hub of accountability or resistance, or, um, or dissent even. So as tensions rose, this dissent eventually boiled over into a full-blown crisis that ends with Uthman radiallahu anhu's assassination. And we see that when Ali is appointed caliph afterwards, Aisha is, she's still dissatisfied, not only in terms of, who's been selected to be the next caliph, but also, and primarily this is where she first situates her disgruntlement, is in the handling or the mishandling, as she saw it, in seeking justice for Uthman's murder. That dissatisfaction then turns into, a concrete opposition. And through that, then she raises an army and she meets Ali in what then became known as the Battle of the Camel. And it was a significant and controversial moment, and one that would define a lot of how her, legacy has been remembered or not. For a long time, the Battle of the Camel was simply not discussed, or if it has been discussed, it's sort of, morphed into different iterations over time. To the point where, I talk about it in the book as well. There was one instance that I read regarding the Battle of the Camel, and it sounded like two friends just met in a park to throw flowers at each other. They'd completely stripped it of all the hostility that was so obviously and clearly there. So going back to the story, despite the controversy, she is still widely recognized as a jurist, as a faqihah, and as a major authority in the Hadith tradition. She's also the subject of Quranic verses, we know, that exonerated her during the incident of the slander, which is the other incident that I look at. It's another pivotal moment that shows just how central she was to the early Muslim community. And of course, she was also the third and most beloved, wife of the Prophet ﷺ. So her legacy is really complex. To put it really simply, among Sunni Muslims, she's deeply loved, she's revered, she's venerated as one of the mothers of the believers. But then, of course, in contrast, in Shia thought, her political opposition to Ali, and her, and the sort of contested designation of Abu Bakr, her father, as the first Caliph of Islam, it's meant that she's often viewed more critically in Shia circles. So she sits at this really interesting crossroads. She's revered, but also contested. She's honored, yet drawn into the heart of both sort of intra-Muslim and interfaith debates as well. So what's important to remember is that Aisha spent nearly her whole life in the orbit of the Prophet ﷺ, and that really gave her a unique vantage point. She had intimate access to his daily life, his teachings, and his inner circle. And the Quran even gives a direct charge to the Prophet's wives. In Surah Al-Ahzab, it's stated, "And remember and proclaim what is recited in your homes of God's revelations and wisdom." And that was a direct command to them, to the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. So of all the wives, I would argue that Aisha seems to have taken that responsibility most fully into the public realm. And in my book, I explore how certain, foundational narratives about Aisha have been reinterpreted again and again throughout Islamic history. So these stories have shifted in tone and emphasis, not necessarily in some pursuit of historical truth, but rather depending on the cultural, theological, or even political pressures of different times. So I try to trace those shifts and also peel back the layers of those retellings to get to the woman herself to some extent. And what emerges is someone who was intellectually curious, critical in her thinking. She was eloquent, she was spiritually grounded, and absolutely committed to justice. She was, politically active as well. Even when it meant challenging authority, that character insight played a big role in how I approached translating Al-Ijaba, because I wanted to make sure that her voice was coming through, not just in what she said, but in how she was saying it. And what struck me most while writing this part of the book was just how different Aisha is from the image of pious Muslim womanhood that tends to be promoted in many contemporary settings. So today, like I said earlier, Muslim women, they're encouraged to be quiet, patient, obedient, retiring. But when we look at Aisha in the tradition, we see almost the opposite. She's bold, she's outspoken, she's politically active, she's deeply pious. And because of that piety, she is unafraid to challenge the men around her, even if that meant challenging the highest state authority, the caliphs. And she finds that confidence not only in her deep-rooted faith, but also in her knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ and her relationship with God. This is what gave her the confidence and the authority. So why not have that extended to all Muslims, and especially Muslim women as well? You have that devotion to God, you have that link to God, you have that understanding of the prophetic tradition. You too should have that confidence then. Um, so what Aisha is doing then is she's offering a powerful alternative model for Muslim women today, one that is devotional, but also critically engaged, that the two can go hand in hand. And she shows us that being faithful doesn't mean being silent, and that being a woman of knowledge can also mean, actually, I want to rephrase that, not only can also mean, but must mean being a woman of action. And there's more, of course. I just don't want to take up too much
Yes.
time. I want to go into I want to talk a little bit about her hadith methodology that emerges as well, because of course that's primary as well. But I'm also cognizant of time, and I can talk about Aisha for a long, long time. So I'll just pause there and see if there's anything further you'd like to discuss.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I feel like Aisha really vindicates, what we really in our gut know about women, like answering the Quranic call for Iqra to, to pursue knowledge, to fight for what is right, to speak up about, the conviction. And that is a form, that's her form of devotion, which is very highly esteemed. Um, Maybe now, actually, my question would be for Miza. And because everybody who knows Musawah knows that Musawah is very much a knowledge building movement. We revere knowledge, we pursue knowledge, but we also marry knowledge to activism. We want to create change on the ground to have a better world for not only women, but women and men and families in Muslim context. So, as a senior program officer at Musawah, Miza, what does this trigger in your mind? Like, what questions do you have for Sophia uh, that allows you to kind of translate this, very robust academic knowledge, new knowledge, into the real world? So over to you.
All right, so that was such an insightful conversation just now. I wish we had more time. I personally, before I came across your work, Sophia, I was actually, I mean, what we all tend to learn about Aisha is about her marriage, her scandal, and a battle that she lost, right? That's the narrative that the mainstream people tend to push forward. But then after reading your book, I was enlightened. Like, she is a scholar in her own right. She was heavily involved in ensuring the right guidance was provided to the people. And one of the things that I enjoyed especially, and it helped me understand and question and peel things back a little bit more, as you said, was the chapter on thinking translation, in which you highlighted that the study of hadith translation is actually understudied, underdeveloped, and how Aisha can serve as a potential tool to understand in the intentions and the translations of the Prophet's words. Now, these sound amazing and so much to learn from, but at the same time, we sometimes hear hadith that appear to demean women. For example, when I went to a religious school in Malaysia, my teacher cited a hadith saying that there are more women in hell than men. I looked it up when I was younger, when I was a kid, and I saw that there is a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari that say this. So how should we as Muslim women respond when we hear such hadith? Especially, when we work with activists as well, they also get this kind of pushback. So what could you comment on this? Give some insights on it.
Yeah, that's such an important and really deeply, I think, resonant question. It's one that I come across often, and I think many Muslim women have wrestled with this, even if it's not in activist spaces. I think in sort of personal lived experience as well. We contend with these things all the time, and often in silence and in discomfort. So I really appreciate you bringing that up openly as well, Miza. I think in learning about Aisha and her correctives, we can be emboldened. As I was saying, each one of us is emboldened, encouraged by her example to take more ownership of our religion, and to know that, if it's being used to deliver harmful ideas and practices, that we have the right to say no. We have the right to question. We have the right to gather knowledge that rectifies the harmful ideas and practices that are being propagated into Islam. And I'd go further to say, beyond having a right, we have a duty, right? We have a duty to rectify these things. So let's take the hadith that you've cited, Misa, as an example, right? About the majority of the inhabitants of hell being women. Yeah, the hadith you're referring to does appear in Sahih Bukhari and in other collections. And in one of its versions, the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said something along the lines of having seen the majority of the inhabitants of hell were women. And this kind of narration, it understandably causes distress for many Muslim women, especially when it's cited without context or critical engagement. So how should we respond? How do we respond as Muslim women, or just as thoughtful Muslims more generally, when faced with something like this? So one of the things that I talk about and develop in the book is an emergent methodology of Aisha. What are the patterns that I saw repeatedly in her response to hadith that she rejected or corrected, right? It wasn't always an outright rejection of a statement. Sometimes she was correcting them, adjusting them for better accuracy. What were the consistent patterns that I was seeing? And I drew them out and I developed an emergent methodology of Aisha's through that. So let's do that with this hadith. The first thing that she would do is, she'd corroborate what was being said according to the Quran. For all Muslims, the Quran is the highest authority in terms of sacred text in Islam. It is the only word of God, and it is the only sacred text that has been promised to be protected by God. Everything else is game, right? So there's nothing, when we look at the Quran, to support such a view. The Quran never states that women are more sinful or more prone to sin or more likely to enter hell. Even our, origin story, if you like, the story of Adam and Eve, there is nothing that indicates that Eve is the one, or Hawa is the one that, beguiles Adam into taking the first bite of this fruit of this forbidden tree. That story seeps in later through, Christian versions that are then brought in through exegesis and other commentaries around hadith, but it's not in the Quran's narrative itself. On the contrary, what we find repeatedly is that the Quran affirms that both men and women are equally accountable, equally capable of righteousness, and also equally capable of evil, right? So in Surah Al-Ahzab, is one example where it's explicitly stated. Allah says, indeed, the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women. And it goes on and, men, women. And then it says, for them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. So we also know that the Quran states that the only thing that promises anyone any sort of success in the hereafter is having a sound, clear heart, regardless of gender. It's in fact, the heart is disembodied from the body, almost to highlight how the body is unimportant. The biology of the body within which that heart resided is completely by the by. It's not important what the gender of a person is. The Quranic principle is moral parity. It's not gendered punishment or gendered elevation for the sake of it. So when a hadith comes and it seems to contradict that, we need to pause and reevaluate the interpretation or contextual framing rather than accept it at face value. And a question that I think is always worth asking is, who does this benefit? Who does it benefit to believe that the majority of women in hell are going to be, the majority of the inhabitants of hell are going to be women? Who does it benefit to believe that? Because it doesn't benefit women in any way. So the second thing that Aisha would do, or another thing that Aisha would do, this isn't necessarily a chronological order in which she would do these things, but these were the methodologies that she clearly was engaging in. The other one was that she would measure hadith against other hadith, right? So she would look to see, okay, does this make sense given what she more broadly knows of the Prophet ﷺ, his teachings, his way of being, his sunnah, and if it doesn't, then we can choose where we want to go, right? So let's measure this statement, measured against other hadith, which include the Prophet ﷺ saying things like, the majority of the inhabitants of paradise will be women. That's also a statement of the Prophet. It just doesn't get circulated quite as commonly. And then, of course, we know that in his final sermon, the final words of the Prophet ﷺ to his community, meaning that, what do the last words of a person mean? Don't we all hang on to the last words of a dying individual? We've all experienced that. We all try to recall, what was the last thing that they said to me? What was the last conversation we had? Well, the last thing that the Prophet ﷺ said to his people was, fear Allah with regards to your treatment of women. And he said it 3 times. So then this hadith just doesn't stand. The idea then of devaluing women or putting them down or on the basis of their gender, it just doesn't tally with other ways in which the Prophet ﷺ was. Aisha also just used her brain, right? She was not afraid to logically and intellectually measure statements that were being attributed to the Prophet ﷺ and ask, like, does this make sense? Is this a logical thing to do? So logically speaking as well, it's really quite a ridiculous claim. The very fact that that Islam was preserved by the women of the household of the Prophet, and that, we know that the wives of the Prophet. So one of the ways in which this, hadith about women being the majority of the inhabitants of hell is interpreted is there's an extension of that hadith in which apparently the Prophet says it's because they argue with their husbands. Again, who does this benefit? Like, the question comes up again, like, who's benefiting from these supposed traditions? So when we know that not only did the wives of the Prophet ﷺ argue with him, question him, but that he actually praised Aisha for that characteristic of hers, that she would ask and she would push back, and she wouldn't stop until she got an answer that satisfied her. And the Prophet ﷺ made dua for her because of that trait of hers. Then why would that be a trait that then goes on to make the majority of the inhabitants of hell women? Because they argue with their husbands. Again, logically, it makes no sense. And when measured up against the hadith, it doesn't make sense, other hadith. And when measured up against the Quran, it doesn't make sense. And then the fourth and final, mode of measurement was what I call Aisha's ethic of care, which essentially means that she was always concerned about ensuring that the best experience of Islam is delivered to every member of the Ummah, not just part of the Ummah, and that would be rooted in ensuring that each individual has a strong connection back to Allah. And so we know, and we've all seen, and I'm sure there are many in the audience as well who will have seen how dangerous and harmful this hadith or other such so-called prophetic traditions are. So yes, unfortunately, narrations like this one are sometimes used in ways that reinforce patriarchal structures, or that silence women's voices, or overlook and undermine and spiritually bypass their pain and their suffering. And this misuse can be, especially harmful in religious education settings where, questioning is discouraged. But part of our intellectual inheritance as Muslims includes critique, debate, and reevaluation. That's why we have such a rich tradition. And we know that, the very tradition that preserved this hadith also preserved countless others in which the Prophet ﷺ showed deep respect, care, and spiritual elevation of women. So reducing an entire gender's moral and spiritual status to a single narration is just not theologically sound. It also does violence to the diversity and complexity of our tradition. It just has to be rejected.
Thank you, Dr. Sofia. So inspiring, so powerful. I wanted to also follow up with a question because we do get this particular question from the audience. How have you seen your work being brought into the community? How have you seen it translated into activism, into action, as you said just now? Could you briefly talk about it a bit more?
Yeah, so I actually took it into the community myself because, like I said, when I was writing this book, it was really important to me that it was accessible. And I was also scared that, okay, Sophia, you write this, you do this research, you write this book, you write this thesis, and then it just gets lost in the libraries of some university somewhere gathering dust. Like, it's still not helpful. It has to be connected to communities, grassroots communities especially. And even as I was writing it, I wanted to make sure that I remained in conversation with that with grassroots communities, because I wasn't going to write at people. I wanted to write with people. And when I say people, I very specifically mean Muslim women. So what I did was I actually partnered up with a local grassroots organization, and I ran a series of workshops. And one of the things that I focused on was exactly the findings of this research. And it was really a very eye-opening experience, because I saw a range of people in front of me. I had those Muslim women who are older, like grandmothers who've really seen life, and generationally as well. And then all the way down to sort of, teenagers, and, and then there was skeptics, and then there were those who were open to the idea of engaging the Hadith tradition. I had those who'd rejected the Hadith because they just found it too problematic. I had those that had really elevated Bukhari and Muslim to, to the same status as the Quran. So I had a real mix of people, which is, to the credit of the organization I was working with. I was working with an organization in Bradford, the Muslim Women's Council. And it was interesting how over the series of workshops, what I would do is I would take a hadith that was very well known to a lot of people. So for example, I would take the hadith perhaps of one that limits women's movement quite often, the one that we're often told, oh, but a woman is not allowed to travel without a mahram. And so I would take this and I would relay the hadith as most people knew it, and people say, oh yes, I know that hadith. And then I'd get them to speak about how that's impacted their lives, in what ways has it limited their travel or impacted their families, because they have to wait on a mahram, they have to wait on a male guardian, a male relative to be able to travel with them. And then I would present to them what was found in Al-Ijaba, which is essentially that when this statement is made, and I really want the audience to visualize this as well, actually, because it's one of my favorite visualizations of what's happening here. So Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, who's, a respected and well-known senior companion of the Prophet ﷺ, he makes a comment almost off the cuff, really, or flippantly rather, where he says, no woman can travel without a mahram. Now, what's so remarkable here is that Aisha sort of reveals a sort of pedagogy, right? She could have gone into a diatribe. She could have got really angry and just had a go at him for the limitations that he was putting on women. But actually, she doesn't directly refute his comment. Instead, she turns to the women in the audience. And I love that, because in her turning away from him, she's reminding all of us to look outwards, right? Like, anybody can come along and start making statements of authority. And if they have positions of authority and they are respected and they do have knowledge, then we will incline to accept what they're saying. But Aisha, in that moment, turns away from him and looks at those who will be affected by what he is saying. She's looking at the marginalized who are not speaking up. And then she says to them, not all of you has a mahram. So again, she doesn't turn to them and tells them, are you hearing this? This is so bad. Like, what is he saying? She actually is inciting them. It's a direct incitement, in fact, of those who are set to be the most affected by this imposition. So she's going beyond just simply saying this is an illogical and harmful imposition. This is the context in which the Prophet ﷺ was speaking, you know, which she could have done. But what she does is she gets the women in the room to consider for themselves what the implication of this statement is, how it would be actually quite a menacing one in their daily lives. They don't all have mahrams. Maybe they do have mahrams, but they're unavailable. Maybe they're unreliable. You know, she's getting them to think about how much this would affect them. So I was trying to, I guess, embody this in my own work by, bringing these traditions to the workshop, that a lot of these women were familiar with, had experienced in their lives. And then I was saying to them, well, here's an equally sound hadith where Aisha is expanding on it and explaining it, or introducing doubt about it. And this is how she lives out her life. You know, Aisha does go and travel without a mahram. You know, she goes on Hajj and she goes on Umrah and she goes all the way to Basra to fight Ali. But like she's traveling without a mahram. So how is she embodying it later on in her life as well? That's all. And we had a discussion, and then I would bring it back and I'd ask them, so how now, with this expanded understanding, will you think about how you move forward? So yeah, I mean, that's one of the ways in which I took it into the community myself, and really was very privileged to be able to have that immediate interaction with Muslim women. And I'd hope that that's what others do too. I'd hope that people would take this book, you know, create reading circles around it. As a lot of you know, I run an online critical reading group where we read, texts by Muslim scholars around gender egalitarian topics. And it's been amazing because I run it online. So I have people from all over the world who attend, and they've gone off and created similar things that, in their own locales, which has been, incredible. I feel like if we do one bit of work, it almost grows tentacles and it goes off in different directions, and people will be inspired and take the work into their own contexts and communities and cultures and adapt it to what their needs are. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but I'd love it if people in the audience had experiences that they would share as well, maybe in comments in the chat.
Yes, if you do have any thoughts to the audiences watching this, share with us, and you can email us as well. All our information is in the chat. One of my colleagues are putting it in there. I think the conversation that we've had so far has really highlighted this clear need to go back to our rich tradition and recover lost knowledge, but also making that knowledge accessible, easy for people, bringing it back to the community for them to apply in their own context, in their own communities around them. We saw how Aisha was a strong and clearly an influential Muslim leader whose knowledge and wisdom was held in high regard by the companions, and this was clearly highlighted in your book, in our conversation today. Sophia, I found that there are two paragraphs in the book that is especially powerful and inspiring, and I would love it if you could share it with the audiences here today.
Yeah, of course. So this is at the very end of the book, I'm so grateful to you, Miza, and Amira, and everybody for your close reading of the book. But yeah, at the end I write, I have argued that the generation of the companions of the Prophet has taken on an almost prophetic status of its own. It is a generation that is not subject to scrutiny. This scenario has evolved as a result of intra-Muslim conflict and partisanship that emanated from it. Opening the companions to scrutiny is perhaps the most radical proposal of this study. Aisha took into consideration the implications of statements on the lives of a marginalized segment of society, women, and sought to do so through what would now be called an ethic of care. She set the standard for such scrutiny and is exemplary in how to pursue this role further, which could aid in reinvigorating and reshaping the Hadith tradition. Similarly, her approach to Islamic law depicts a commitment to the Quran and the prophetic tradition, but also to an outcome that provides the most optimum results for the community of believers. The excavation of Aisha's scholarly voice and the elevation of her status on the grounds of her contribution to the very production of knowledge in Islam, rather than simply in her being the only virgin bride or shown to the Prophet in a dream wrapped in silk and indicated for marriage, calls for a reimagining and realigning of the Muslim imaginary too. An imaginary in which Muslim women can and do hold their male counterparts and those in authority to account, and that their accounting is taken to hold equal validity. Where Muslim women can deign to take on roles that have no precedent in the community, because precedent is not incumbent in order for it to be a possibility. Where Muslim women contribute to knowledge generation and production, and not just the relaying and transmitting of patriarchy-approved interpretations of the faith. A Muslim imaginary that can consider Muslim women's lived experiences as sound and normative considerations in the development of Islamic law, rather than as exceptional and marginal experiences. A Muslim imaginary in which Muslim refers every part as much to Muslim woman as it does to Muslim man.
Love it. Thank you for that, Sophia. That was lovely. I actually, we have so many questions in the Q&A section. We can't address all of them, unfortunately. You can reach out to us via info@musawah.org. You can also reach out to Sophia as well. We would love your feedback. Sophia, I have a funny question to ask you, but like we get this a lot. They're asking, how do we get your book?
Oh yeah. So you can, if you Google it, you can pretty much get it anywhere. But I think also if you go to the OUP website, the Oxford University Press website, you can order from there. And I believe that all attendees have been given a 30% discount code. So I hope that helps. Or order into your libraries. Use your libraries, my friends. Order into your libraries as well.
Thank you for that, Sophia. So we've come to the end of the talk show, and it's such a pleasure to have all of you here. So on behalf of the team, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode as much as we did. We would love to hold more episodes in the future. So please answer the feedback form that's in the chat. In the next episode, Sophia and I will be in conversation with Dr. Mulki Al-Sharmani to discuss her new book about Islamic feminism. Knowledge never ends, so stay tuned for date announcements of future episodes by following us on social media or subscribing to our newsletter. We hope to see you next time.